Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
It's a month since the tragedy at Grenfell Tower. This morning, friends and family of 5-year-old Isaac Paulus, one of the youngest to die in the disaster, gathered for his funeral. Frankie McCamley reports.
Carried with love, followed by pain. 5-year-old Isaac Paulus was today described as a smart and generous little boy who had just learnt to read. Isaac lived on the 18th floor of Grenfell Tower. He tried to escape but got separated from his family. His body was found on the 13th floor. Other pupils in his school managed to escape.
We're absolutely devastated as a school community. The reception class that he was in, just feel that something is missing, someone is missing. We're trying our best to support families and to look out for those children who are really struggling with this, and the families that are really struggling with this, and provide as much support as we can.
I want to do for them.
Johnny Ragassa helped Isaac's younger brother to safety, but he lost his best friend in the fire.
I tried to be strong, to go back to work, but I couldn't. So still we are emotional, even myself. And I'm still emotional, I don't know. Mentally, I'm not settled yet. So it takes a while. I don't know if it's affecting me that much. I don't know what the family, how it affects them.
As for those who can't bury their loved ones because they've yet to be identified, some use today to say goodbye and keep the tragedy in people's thoughts. A month on, residents and people from the local community have come together for a silent march to show support and remember that night that changed their lives forever. Some now plan to repeat the demonstration on the 14th of every month. And a few miles away, another funeral for 82-year-old Ali Jafari. He lived on the 11th floor. He tried to take the lift because he had a heart condition. He never made it out. Frankie McCamley, BBC News.
Now, a month after the Grenfell Tower disaster, another funeral. This time, 5-year-old Isaac, one of the youngest victims who lived with his family on the 13th floor. But new documents dating back to 2012 show that architects originally wanted to use more expensive, fire-resistant cladding around the building. More in a moment on that, but first, there's still anger in the local community over the authorities' response. Porrick O'Brien is in North Kensington now. Porrick, tell us what's going on there.
Well, Kathy, we're about 10 minutes from Grenfell Tower here outside a community event which is looking at the management of donations to victims. It's organised by a group called One Voice. The thing is, of course, there's more than one voice here. There are many people who feel that their voices need to be heard, many people who want to be kept informed, and many people that feel that that is not happening to an extent that they would like to see. So, for example, just to give you a snapshot, this is a letter from Sajid Javid, the Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government. It was sent out about 2 weeks ago, and in it he explains that people who have lost their homes should expect to be allocated a new one by the 5th of July. But we understand that lots of people didn't receive this letter by that deadline. The department has told us that that is a flexible deadline, but it still compounded this sense of a community left out in the cold, left in the dark by the powers that be. We have new revelations on the programme tonight as well. As you explained, my colleague Ed Hauker has received documents that reveal that if the vision of the architect for that original refurbishment of the tower had been adhered to, this terrible tragedy could have been averted.
There is still so much we do not know about the Grenfell fire, about that night and the years that led there. This morning, the most senior officer in the Met was asked, why was it taking so long to number the dead?
But I cannot give you a timescale by which it will be absolutely definitely resolved. The 9/11 identifications were still coming in many, many, many years later. If it takes a year to do the job, it takes a year to do the job.
But what about the year before the fire and the years before that? Channel 4 News has seen a document which shows that at the beginning, safer materials were considered for the cladding of Grenfell Tower than those that made it onto the building and may have helped the fire to spread. This document from 2012 is full of plans for improving Grenfell. In it are early discussions between the architect and council about the cladding. The architect explains an overclad and rain screen system is being proposed. Zinc or Eternit particle board are being investigated. These are both materials that are less combustible than those that were eventually used. OK, the council officer responds, but suggested that the colour choice should avoid grey. Positivity bounces off the pages of this document. There are plans for bright colours, for more amenities, plans for better housing. But the good intentions end in tragedy. And we already have some sense about why that is. In July 2014, 2 years after this document's written, the council begin to squeeze the cladding budget. And so the zinc rain screen is replaced with aluminium, and £280,000 is saved. The stuff they put on the building is cheaper. It is also less fire safe. Under European fire safety standards, the rain screen options proposed by the architect in 2012 have higher fire ratings than the materials that were used.
There's some very good things in here, very good intentions. You can see that the architect wants there to be a very high performance material used for the cladding of the building, and unfortunately it seems that later on in the process that material has been replaced with something which is cheaper and doesn't perform so well.
A spokesman for Kensington and Chelsea Council said,
"We do not think it is right to make comments relevant to the inquiry or subject to the investigation until this issue has been discussed with the police and the solicitors to the public inquiry." That public inquiry will now be forced to consider if preliminary plans for Grenfell Tower were safer than the reality that appeared on its walls.
Well, I'm now joined from West London by Abdurrahman Syed from the Al-Manar Muslim Cultural Heritage Centre. Abdurrahman Syed, the council leader has been replaced. The government's decided to send in this task force. The majority of families have been offered accommodation. Is chaos finally being replaced by order or not?
I haven't heard the last part of the question, but in terms of the accommodation offer, so far it's a temporary arrangement. So people are still waiting for a proper permanent transfer to, in terms of housing or flats, whatever they can get. But it has to be a permanent one. The current one is temporary. It's temporary arrangement.
And how long do you think you're going to have to wait to get that permanent accommodation then?
Well, I think the authorities are promising that this will not be a long wait. So anything is expected between 1 to 2 weeks. But obviously, it all remains to be seen. And I think the authorities, especially the local authority, will be the one to explain if there is going to be any delays.
You don't sound 100% confident that what the authorities say is going to happen will happen. I mean, that sort of speaks to the heart of this still remaining lack of trust, isn't there?
Yes, of course. I mean, there is always a communication gap at present, and which needs to be addressed. From our part, we've been trying to help both the community and the local authorities to engage constructively and make sure information is available, not just about housing, but about everything that is related to the Grenfell Tower fire.
Well, how do you think the new council leader can regain trust from the residents? How is that possible now, do you think?
I think there needs to be a trust-building measure and process to make sure people regain their confidence on both sides, in fact, because I mean, the disaster was not something planned or expected. So, yes, there has been some shortcomings and lack of proactive engagement. But now there's no reason not to have that, especially we're talking now 1 month after the whole tragedy. So there must be leadership role, coordination, and the community is willing to, give the authorities the chance to explain. But that needs to come as soon as possible. It doesn't need to wait, because the longer this thing waits, the more anger there will be within the community, which will be quite hard to control if it goes out of out of hand.
And I mean, when it comes to the inquiry, you know, there has been a bit of not a great amount of faith in the judge in terms of the empathy he might have, the understanding he might have. Is there a sense that if you can have a team of residents assisting him in that inquiry, that might be a good compromise?
I think there must be some involvement of the residents and all the representatives of the different communities within the residents. I think there has been some consultation to some level in regard to the terms of reference of that inquiry. But we need to see some evidence and also more consultation and engagement to make sure the terms of reference includes every issue that is of concern to the community, also to the whole cause of the disaster of the Grenfell Tower fire.
Indeed. Abdurrahman Syed, thank you very much for joining us.
Last week, we reported on the often heroic response of the firefighters to the Grenfell Tower blaze, and as well the failings in some of the equipment they had. The biggest surprise was that no tall ladder was dispatched to Grenfell until half an hour after the initial call. This, it turned out, was London Fire Brigade policy, to wait and see before sending an aerial ladder out. Well, we've been doing some follow-up work with the other fire services of the UK, and it turns out that the bulk of them have the opposite policy. London was in a minority in not sending a tall ladder automatically to a fire in a high-rise. London has adapted its policy since Grenfell, as an interim measure at least, but there are still 9 other services in the country that don't deploy. And we found other variations in the plans of different fire services. In other words, this is yet another area where, post-Grenfell, you examine national policy closely and find it wanting. James Clayton reports.
A month after the horrifying events of the 14th of June, and a clearer picture of how the London Fire Brigade responded to the Grenfell Tower fire has begun to emerge. Last week, Newsnight reported that the first high ladder, or aerial, arrived 31 minutes after the first fire engine. London has now changed its predetermined attendance, what it would automatically send to a high-rise fire, to include a high ladder as an interim measure. But how would other fire services have reacted to a similar fire in a high-rise building? We contacted every fire service in the country to ask what their predetermined attendance was to a fire in a tower block. We found that 70% of fire services would have sent an aerial ladder, this is before Grenfell, remember, to any high-rise fire. Several fire services have changed their policy to include an aerial ladder to any reported fire, including Manchester and London. However, 9 fire services, including Tyne and Wear, Leicestershire, Kent, Lancashire and Cambridgeshire, won't send an aerial ladder in the first instance. The crux of the problem is this. The same fire in the same tower block elicits wildly different responses from fire services across the country. Now take this building behind me. It's a high-rise building in Essex, and if there's a fire here, the first response of the local fire service won't be to send a high ladder, whereas in neighbouring Suffolk, they will. Lauren Irish is a community nurse who cares for a resident inside the tower block.
At the end of the day, it's a tower block. You hear that it's on fire. Why wouldn't you send the highest ladder you've got to get them out quicker, rather than just sending a little one? What's that going to do? You know, who's going to reach the top floor? It's not fair. So that's my opinion on it. It's not. No, I wouldn't like to be on the top floor.
Essex Fire Service say that they have inspected all of their high-rise buildings post-Grenfell and that no changes to their response plans are needed. Sally Leavesley led the review to modernise fire services in Queensland, Australia.
An aerial ladder is now essential for all tower fires in this country following Grenfell, and the response time will have to be arranged so that it is well and truly within 15 minutes. Any new policy about aerial ladders must also take account of what numbers are needed, because there may not be enough to really adequately provide the risk that we now know is with these buildings throughout the country.
The differences in predetermined attendances between various fire rescue services go beyond whether they send an aerial ladder or not. For example, Kent sends out 3 fire engines to a reported tower block fire, whereas in neighbouring Surrey, the same tower block fire gets 6 fire engines, an aerial ladder and a command support team. A London Fire Brigade spokesman told Newsnight,
"It is important to understand that fires in high-rise buildings are nearly always dealt with internally, not usually needing an aerial appliance. The fundamental issue of high-rise safety remains that buildings are maintained to stop fires spreading."
Few could have foreseen what happened at Grenfell, but after the disaster, questions have to be asked about whether there should be a national minimum attendance to a high-rise fire. Can it be right that your postcode dictates what kind of response the fire services will deliver?
James Clayton with that. Now, if you're interested to find out how your local fire service would immediately respond to a tower block fire, well, then you can do so on the BBC's website, where we've created an interactive map with all the data that we've collected. We did ask the London Fire Brigade for an interview tonight, in fact, as well as each of the other services whose plans don't include sending a high ladder automatically to a tower block fire, but nobody was available. I am, though, joined by Matt Rack, General Secretary of the FBU. Very good evening to you. Let's see is there any sense in the position that says you don't need to send one? So London Fire Brigade say, actually, we deal with these things internally, and you assess the situation before you deploy.
That's there's a logic to what the London Fire Brigade are saying entirely. The firefighters are trained to fight tower block fires internally because of compartmentalisation that we've discussed before, and using internal dry rising mains and so on. I think what Grenfell Tower has demonstrated is that the risk has clearly changed, because that is premised on the basis that the fire will not spread externally, and clearly we've got a case where fire did spread externally, and we've now found other tower blocks around the country also failing similar tests.
Right. Now, is it your case that it should always have been the case that we're sending high ladders, or is it your case that now we've got dangerous cladding on buildings that we hadn't understood, and we've seen the risks, now it is time to learn from that and to send the aerials with the...
There's 2 points I would like to make. First of all, I think the other point that you've raised there, the number of fire engines is a key issue. The number of firefighters is crucial. In terms of high-reach vehicles, aerial appliances, we would generally have said that they should be on tower block fires, yes.
So your position would be always should have, but especially now we've seen the lessons.
Especially now we've seen Grenfell.
Why would they not just always send them out? Is it expense? Is that the problem? Is it
aerial ladders, high-reach vehicles are the problem that we've had is that they are very specialist. They therefore are used rarely. Sometimes people could use them and don't use them.
But they're just sitting around. If they're not being taken to a fire, then
mean the firefighters aren't doing anything. Firefighters can do lots of other things. One of the problems that we've identified in our own research is actually because it's also about speed of attack, how quickly do fire engines get there. The majority of aerial appliances in the UK are not permanently crewed, so there are even further delays in getting them to incidents.
So if you put them on the PDA, the predetermined attendance, you would probably have to then have them always crewed up, and it might cost them more.
That makes sense for us, and the London ones are permanently crewed.
Right. Matt, do you trust the people who are running the fire services of the UK to be competent at making these decisions?
Well, we have raised concerns about this sort of issue for more than a decade. We used to have national standards of fire cover. We now have local so-called risk management plans. What they are in reality are budget management plans. And you've seen that the risk assessments over time, as budgets are squeezed, the response is declined over the past few years.
But I mean, in a way, the government says, look, we leave this up to the local people because they'll make up their mind. Many of them visit the individual buildings we're talking about, so they know the buildings. And in Kent, they say we visited some of the buildings and we don't think we need to send the aerial initially.
At the turn of the century, there was government-funded research about what firefighters do at different types of incidents, and you could map out how many firefighters you need to fight a fire in a terraced house, a tower block, and so on. And I have to say that on that, so that was government funded. We've done similar research ourselves. The idea that and it depends how many firefighters are on the fire engine, because the number of fire engines itself may not be an adequate clue. How many firefighters are on each fire engine? The idea of sending 3, in our view, is completely inadequate to fight a fire in a tower block.
Matt Rack, thanks very much indeed. And should say, London have, at least as an interim measure, changed their policy since the Grenfell fire.